I want to talk a little bit about air filters and how they work on a two-cycle engine. A two-cycle engine is nothing but an air pump. So what you want to consider is when you pull the rope, the piston goes up, it creates a negative pressure down here in the crankcase. That means just like sucking air through a straw, it pulls air through the filter. Then it kind of speeds up and cools down as it goes through the carburetor, but it also then sprays it with your fuel mix. That's where it gets its lubrication. That fuel and air then goes down the port and fills the crankcase. So the first place that fuel and air goes is to the crankcase because there's not a quart of oil down there to lubricate the rod, the wrist pin, the bearings and seals. So your oil that's in your fuel mix is what lubricates all of that. So piston goes up, fills the bottom. Piston goes down, it now creates a positive pressure and it pushes that fuel and air mixture up to the combustion area. Now, piston goes up, fills the bottom, piston goes down, fills the top, and as it goes back up, it's filling the bottom, but just before top dead center, bam, the spark plug fires. And that's where the combustion begins. In other words, now that last little squash area between the top of the piston, the dome of the cylinder, now basically forces that burned gas and air out into the exhaust system. So that's why they call it a two-stroke. It all happens in two strokes. So let's say that we have a 50cc chainsaw, which is about 3 cubic inch, about the average selling size firewood saw and small production saw. Let's say that we have a air filter that's halfway clean. In other words, you know, it kind of tapped it off a little bit, but the pores in the filter and most of the surface area is pretty clogged. We've got a 50cc pull-in from our size of the engine itself, but now we can't get but half the air. And you all know what happens if you leave the choke onto a two-cycle engine. Basically, you flood it if you pulled past that. And that's kind of what starts to happen here. It still has the vacuum or the low to pull in the fuel through the carburetor, but it's only getting half of the air. So now you've got a real rich mixture. People don't realize sometimes, but it's a 14.7 to 1 stoichiometric air to fuel ratio. And that's 14.7 parts of air to 1 part of fuel. So now what happens is if we're not getting the fuel that's designed in that particular combustion area, we're going to end up with a what? A lean run, yeah? And then we start to think about if we have less air, we now have a rich run. So you start to think about here, you're trying to start somewhat of a flooded saw. Very important, that air filter must be clean so it's getting all the air that it's designed to do to mix with the amount of fuel that that engine is geared to take in. Similar if you get in high elevations where you have, let's say, 8,500 feet. If you have 8,500 feet where you're running the two-cycle, you have less air. That means you have to lean out the mixture. Well, that's quite the opposite for what we're talking about here. We've now leaned out the air, but we haven't changed the fuel ratio. And so now you've got a rich run, it's smoking, no power, those kinds of things. You have to adjust it back up to where you have the proper mix to air to be able to take and produce the power. So that's a little bit. Very important that your air filter is clean. That thing is nothing but a two-cycle pump.